Today we are talking about hunter builds. This is coming a little bit later than planned. There were some circumstances that didn't allow me to make this earlier, but now it's finally ready. And this is gonna be a big video that covers a lot of things that I wasn't able to fully cover in past videos of this sort. And different from these past videos, we'll include pretty much everything that you can think of. We'll include power builds, attack speed builds, pen builds, crit builds as well this time, and a new boots build to kind of show where you can go with that. Before we begin, however, I have to thank a few people who were involved in this video in one way or another. Impish Coconut made a calculation for the new hunter builds for the new patch, kind of confirming what I was suspecting in regards to the different builds that will be viable and how strong they are across different levels of defense as well. I will link that down below. And the data that I primarily worked with here is Kiro's DPS comparison tool that I will also link down below. If you want to check out any hunter DPS stats, any comparisons in that regard, I would highly recommend that. That is basically the best source to quickly check different stats, and it's very, very accurate. And last but not least, a quick thank you to Schnitzel for pointing out to me that the most default hunter is Hachiman, so we will use Hachiman for the comparisons here, as he has the most average aggressive stats at least. So you may remember especially Impish Coconut's name from just a few days ago basically, where I was talking about the Silverbranch Bow Build that was very strong in the last patch. And we will look at that again as well. So Silverbranch Bow just had a very high stat bloat and was suddenly becoming more popular through that. Now there are some other hunter items that got buffed or changed because they kinda fell behind in the meta, and that's the previous tier 2 items Asi and Ichaival. I quickly go over the changes here just so you know what exactly is up with them. The new Ichaival costs 2,450 gold, has 30 physical power, 30% attack speed, and every successful basic attack increases your physical power by 15 and reduces the enemy attack speed by 10% with a maximum of 3 stacks. So a total of up to 75 physical power, 30% attack speed, 30% attack speed reduction to the enemy, but no more penetration, and quite a heavy price. Most people seem to think that this is the heavy hitter from this patch. This is the big item that changed most of everything basically, but I kind of had a different expectation. I kind of beg to differ a little bit here, because the other item that was changed was Asi. Asi is now 2,550 gold, so rather expensive, more expensive than, for example, Executioner, with 20 physical power, 20% physical lifesteal, 25% attack speed, and 15 penetration. The passive was also slightly adjusted. If you drop below 35% health, you gain an additional 30% physical lifesteal for 5 seconds. It can only occur once every 15 seconds. The reason why I felt that Asi would have more impact here is because it's basically the perfect all-rounder. It has a fair bit of power, a fair bit of lifesteal, a fair bit of attack speed, and a fair bit of penetration. That's all the core stats a hunter wants, outside of maybe the fact that eventually you want some crit as well, depending on the situation. With the amount of lifesteal it provides from the start, and it can provide with the passive as well, it is basically the best trading option for most situations as well, and even outclasses items that have a little bit more lifesteal by default, because the passive will hit so hard in that regard. And that all combined made me think that Asi would be a really good option now. And now let's look into the numbers and see what of that held true. So as usual, we have to make a few conditions for a DPS comparison, because otherwise you can kind of build better items but lose out on certain stats. The first rule is no double stacking, because it just hinders your power curve too much, so no double power items like Devils and Transcendence. Then the build has to include one lifesteal item at least. If you want to go without lifesteal, you can always get a little bit more damage in other ways. And the build also has to include one protection reduction item, which will be Executioner in any case here. I know I often see people saying I have this super good DPS build, but it actually doesn't include Executioner, which means it doesn't do anything against tanks, and that makes the build overall very weak, especially because even squishier characters have a decent amount of protection in later stages. I also pre-checked in every build here if Ninja Tabe or Warrior Tabe would give more DPS, and just went with whatever is the better option for that particular build, because that's just a discussion not worth having, as it's such a same price situation anyways. The builds also all have to include boots, unless specified otherwise with the later variations. We'll get to that. The first build that we'll look at here is the one that Impish Coconut found to be the highest DPS for most hunters in most situations. And that is basically what most people were expecting it to be. You have Ninja Tabai, because it usually has more DPS if you have a little bit of power in other items. You have Transcendence for that super high power spike. You have Ichaival, you have Asi, you have Executioner, and Kinsai's. Very much both new items included, a lot of attack speed outside of that, and then the power from Transcendence. Almost hitting attack speed cap, very high power through Trans, but also Ichaival, and lifesteals through Asi. Now there are a few metrics that we can use to compare these builds. The raw DPS, which only really tell us how much that build will do in a vacuum. The power that you will have before hitting a target, and the DPS that you will have before hitting a target. The power and the damage that you will have after 4 hits, so when Ichaival and Executioner are fully applied, or on the 4th hit, and the DPS on the 4th hit. It's interesting to look at both stats at the start and at the end a little bit, because sometimes you won't even get 4 hits in and the initial hits are more important, and the power is obviously important, especially for ability-based characters as well, along with penetration. For this first build, that means we have 1124 DPS. The power on the first hit is 238, a value that we'll see quite often here. The DPS on the first hit is 549. The power on the 4th hit is 283. And the DPS on the 4th hit is 754. And I can tell you already that this is a relatively high number, otherwise this wouldn't have won in many of the calculations. But there are other options and reasons to consider other options. Another benefit of this build is of course that it reduces the target's attack speed by 30%. How much value you put on that is up to you. On one hand, it can mean a lot in a trade with an AA character, with either a hunter, an AA assassin, or an AA warrior especially. But on the other hand, sometimes it can also be almost useless. If you're doing it against the enemy guardian, he will probably not care all too much. So this is worth keeping in mind. And all the DPS calculation here, by the way, for these hits is done against a target with 100 physical protection. Different protection values could shift these values a little bit, depending on what kind of build you're going for. But overall, between the raw DPS and 100 protections, we can already see a decent picture of how good these builds are. And we could expand that further and then add like 200 protections, 250, but that's really just the tanks and heavy frontliners reaching that, and I don't think the conversation should be focused on them when it comes to your damage output, because those are not the characters you're typically looking to shoot down quickly. You're targeting the assassins, the hunters, and the mages primarily. At the end of the day, with all of these builds, including one protection shred item, the DPS difference won't be that massive against a tank. And that brings us to the second build. In this one, I traded out Ichaival for Silverbranch Bow. Everything else stays the same, just to see how Silverbranch Bow is doing now in this new build variation. The result here are slightly lower DPS values, roughly 100 raw DPS less. The power on the first hit stays the same, the DPS on the first hit actually goes up. Instead of 549, we have 592. And that is because Ichaival comes with less penetration from the start than Silverbranch Bow. However, on the 4th hit, the power stays on 238, meaning ability hunter would do less damage with this build, and the DPS actually is at 745, so slightly below the Ichaival build. I think it's very interesting to see here that the DPS is initially higher, and then even after 4 hits only falls off ever so little in comparison. So if your character is not very focused on having a lot of power and is just more out on the DPS and the ability damage doesn't matter that much, like say a Ram, then Silverbranch Bow will do a lot more for you, especially since if you use a steroid, you will also get a further power amplification. On top of that, that will definitely ramp up your DPS more. That already kind of shows us that Ichaival is not the be-all, end-all item in every situation, as it takes a while to stack and it only comes with power, not penetration. We do, however, have to keep in mind that you technically would have an attack speed reduction with Ichaival as well. With the Silverbranch build, on the other hand, you could technically get a super minor DPS increase by building Bloodforge instead of Asi, but I think Asi is a much more well-rounded item as compared to Bloodforge. And with the extra attack speed that you're also getting more kin size procs, which is better against tanks, so it's really up and down situation. I think Asi is just a better option. And that brings us to the third build, where we actually include Bloodforge, but in this case we throw out Asi, and we have Ichaival in this build instead of Silverbranch Bow, so basically the first build, but with Bloodforge. What you'll see here is that the initial power is the highest we'll have in any build. We're starting with 293 power, and again with a very similar raw DPS value. This means for ability damage, this build is great, though you do sacrifice some penetration, so it's not always higher damage. The DPS on the first hit is 514, so a little bit less. On the fourth hit, the power is up at 338, again the highest value that we have, unsurprisingly, because we have both Ichaival and Blood Fortune here and Transcendence. The DPS overall drops down though. We had 686 with full stacks, which is significantly less than the other builds offer, so I don't really think there's much of a reason to build this build over all the other options. Again, keep in mind, however, that this is an Ichaival build, which will reduce the enemy's attack speed by 30%. So in a direct trade, you would basically end up with even attack speed if they had another build that doesn't include Ichaival. Then we have the Crusher option. Crusher was always a very close item in DPS efficiency as well, and I wanted to see how well it does here, if it falls off a lot with these new items, or if it can still hold its own, especially since it's often the preferred choice for more ability-based hunters. We again take the first build here and simply swap out Ichaival for the Crusher. So Ninja Tabi Transcendent, the Crusher, Asi, the Executioner, and Concise. The raw DPS definitely goes down to 973, but the power on the first hit is actually pretty much even with all the other ones we've seen with 238. And we also have the penetration from the Crusher plus the additional ticks for any abilities that you use. The resulting DPS on the first hit is actually pretty good as well. 572 is towards the higher end of DPS values we see here, so that's why it's in cursive. The power on the other hand stays at 238, which is towards the lower end, so even after 4 hits nothing really changes because you don't have Ichaival. And the DPS after 4 hits is kind of in the lower middle spectrum with 726. Of course, when you have more protection reduction to begin with, you feel the impact a little less here, but don't think that this means that Crusher is bad by any stretch of imagination. Again, Crusher has the ticks on top of that, and it's just slightly behind the other builds when it comes to DPS output here, which is still very, very good. And I personally prefer front-loaded damage over back-loaded damage, so to speak, sometimes. So I would probably rather have this than Ichaival on quite a few hunters that can make decent use of Crusher. That's the important part. If you don't have enough abilities to do that, then you probably don't want to consider that. But there's something else that we can do with the Crusher. Now that we know that Crusher is kind of playing in the same ballpark, I wanted to see what happens if we actually don't include Asi and instead go back to the basics, go back to Devourer's Gauntlet. So the build would be Ninja Tabi, Devourer's Gauntlet, and now we can include both the Crusher and Ichaival, as well as Executioner and Concise. That didn't work all too well. The power is lower than anything else really here with 215. The DPS is 508 at the start, so already lower than almost any other build. The power goes up to 260, which is towards the okay end, but the DPS at the end are also just 702. If Devourer's Gauntlet was significantly better when it comes to sustain than Asi, I would see a reason to build this build. Or if you really want to have the attack speed reduction on the enemy, I can see a reason to build this build. But for most characters, I think going for a Transcendence route and including Asi in the build at some point is probably more beneficial. Now we're moving into very interesting territory, an item that has seen a lot of use lately, even in the SPL, and that is Odysseus Bow. In this build we're gonna go with the first build once again, and we're just gonna swap out Ichaival for Odysseus Bow, so we have our Asi in our build, and we have our Transcendence and our Ninja Tabi. This build actually comes out decently, I would say. We have 1107 raw DPS, so very much the standard at this point. We have an initial power of 208, which is very, very low. But that's not all too surprising because we simply don't have any power from Odysseus Bow. It makes up for it in other ways. We have 598 DPS, so very much towards the higher end here and one of the strongest DPS builds in the first hits. And then the fourth hit still has 208 power, so still very, very low. And the fourth hit has 743 DPS, which is very, very close to the top. And this is including the Odi Bow shot on every fourth hit already, but only 1 bounce. So what we can see here is that Odysseus Bow doesn't really give you the same benefit when you're very ability based and you really want to have a lot of power, but it very much helps when your focus is more on having some sort of DPS increase directly, and we will see why that is even more than we can see here. Because what we're assuming here is just a single bounce of Odysseus Bow. Typically that's not the case, especially not in a team fight. So if we're looking at more than one target, then the DPS will obviously shift because the bounce will go around. And I figured I'd just include one bounce here that goes against a target that has full protection, so no execution applied or anything, and see how that changes the DPS. And that amps up the DPS to 813 already, which is the highest value we've seen so far. If we include another bounce to another target with the same defense again, then the DPS goes up to 883. Very, very high value. So there's definitely a benefit in going Odysseus Bow, but you have to have the right character for it, essentially, as on one hand you don't want to be too reliant on ability damage, and on the other hand you can run into the issue of overcapping, though it's kind of like a question of how much of an issue that really is. If you, for example, throw on a warrior tabai and then you use your steroid, then you can not overcap as much, and the DPS of Odysseus Bow can still definitely be worth it. So what if we say we want to have Odysseus Bow in the build, but we also want to have Ichaival and Asi? What if we throw out Kinsai's? Let's try it out, because this one is very, very interesting. Usually almost any build will include Kinsai's so that you have this higher damage against tanks, but maybe that's not what we're after. Maybe we just want to have a lot of pen or a lot of power and just want to hit very hard and very quick. Well, we can do that, and our results are as follows. Roughly 1050 raw DPS. We have 215 power at the start, relatively low again, and we have 504 DPS, the lowest that we've seen so far. But also not that much lower than the rest, it's more like on the level of the Devil's build. Then the power on the fourth hit goes up to 260, which is actually towards the higher end of the spectrum, and the DPS go up to 711. That is not very far behind all these other builds. It's not towards the high end, but it's something that can definitely work. And again, if we get multiple bounces, our DPS goes up. For the first additional bounce, we go up to 791 DPS. For the second additional bounce, we go up to 871 DPS. So, in conclusion out of that, you can have a build without Kinsai's. In this case, by the way, you want to build Warrior Tabai because otherwise you have too much attack speed. And this is more DPS beneficial this way. If this is a good option for you, really highly depends on the game. If the enemy team is really not building a lot of health, this can be good. But if there are multiple targets that have more towards 2500 or more health, then you won't benefit all too much from this. So it's very, very situational, and it depends on the strength of Kinsai's in that particular situation primarily. So it's something that you should choose in later stages of the game. You just go for other items first and then see at this point, do I want Odysseus Bow or do I want Kinsai's? And then you flex it depending on that. Or you choose not to build another one of these items, that, like for example Ichaival. What we've done with almost every build so far is include Transcendence or another high power stacking item being Devourer's Gauntlet. But what if we say we don't want to stack, we just want to go for raw aggression attack speed items? This is something that we've actually seen Funballer do in the SPL in the past. I think it was with Anhur, and it was kind of surprising to me, but it made sense at the same time. You just play around this early aggression of these items and then transition into a late game where you can still do decent DPS through just attack speed. And that should work better now with these items being changed. So the build here would be Warrior Tabai because you really don't need more attack speed from that. That's just going to lower your DPS. And then Ichaival, Asi, Silverbranch Bow, the Executioner, and Kinsai's. The DPS value again here is 1053, so very much in the middle. The power that we initially have is super low. It's 193, but this is not a power build, so that's not really a shocker. The DPS on the first hit is 537. So not exactly the highest, but then also not super low either. Not that far away from a build that includes Transcendence. If we look at the fourth hit, then we will have a power of 238 through Ichaival, which is still towards the lower end, but also not terrible, and a total DPS of 758. So against a target with 100 protections, this build actually has slightly higher DPS than the build with Transcendence. This shifts depending on what target you're going against. The more protection they have, the less value you get out of your flat penetration. So yeah, it's not quite that simple, but in this particular situation, this is super good for DPS only. And I think it's worth keeping in mind just from the perspective of being able to have this heavy boxing potential throughout the game just through going for attack speed items and not getting any power items after your boots. This of course also synergizes well with attack speed steroids as you have Silverbranch Bow. So it's absolutely an option that's worth considering. You can also consider throwing Odysseus Bow in there, but that will shift your values overall. So keep this build in mind for situations where maybe applicable or where you might want to consider building Transcendence later, for example. So at this point, a quick recap of what we've learned before we get into some different spectrums of items. DPS-wise, most of these builds are somewhat similar. The ones that kind of fall off are the ones that either include Bloodforge and ditch Asi or include Devourer's Gauntlet. Every build with Asi basically has been performing better here in one regard or another, unless you're looking for very specific stats. You can consider switching out items like Concise for Odysseus Bow, you can consider including the Crusher, you can consider including Silverbranch Bow, and they will all give you very similar results overall with different power spikes, different DPS spikes at different amounts of hits, and of course with the different levels of attack speed it'll also take you a little bit longer or shorter to get to the right amount of stacks that you need for your DPS. With all that in mind, how does crit compare? I've tried out various crit builds. I'm not going to go through all of them in detail because it's really not going to tell you much more, because with crit, different from these other options, it's not so much about what's better situationally, you just want to have the max damage. Yes, you can go for Poison Star or Wind Demon and you can get the additional passive benefits, but DPS wise it will always be worse, and that's okay because they have those other benefits. So if you want to build them for that and drop like 50 DPS or something, sure. But this is the max DPS build that I could find on the current patch, and that is Ninja Tabi for attack speed, Transcendence for power, yes, a crit build that includes Transcendence, Asi for the lifesteal and attack speed, and then Executioner for the protection shred. After that, you build your crit items Rage and Deathbringer. Transcendence makes these crits hit much heavier, and from what I was able to find, that turns out to be more beneficial than going for an additional crit item in any situation that I was able to test here. There may be some circumstances where that's not the case, but I couldn't find them. Now, how good is this build? You have 1325 raw DPS, the highest we had so far. The build has 228 power, which is actually not too low. It's not as good as some other values, but it's definitely not terrible either for ability damage. And the build without any stacks has the highest DPS we've seen so far with 663. With full stacks, your power doesn't change, still 228. But you go up to 823 DPS. That obviously requires you to crit, but this is calculated by the average chance to crit and the number of hits, so it should land around that value in many situations. That means that the crit build is effectively the best build for raw DPS and beats other builds by roughly 70 DPS, with the exception of the Odysseus Bow build, which has its own set of perks through the additional bounces. So crit is definitely better when it comes to trading down a single target, whereas Odysseus Bow can be much better actually in a team fight depending on how many bounces you can get through. But that's just with fully stacked Rage. What if Rage is not fully stacked? Then our DPS goes down to 765, which you may notice is still the highest DPS value. So even if you can't get any Rage stacks, the DPS on a single target without any other perks that you get with the other builds here is still very, very good with the crit build. But you lose, for example, the benefit to steal attack speed from the enemy, so you have to be okay with that. There are a few interesting things to note about this build. First of all, it's the only build that stays below 2.0 attack speed here. That means that on one hand, you have to hit more hits to actually get to the final DPS value, and you have to be better with your aim. But on the other hand, it means that if you have an attack speed steroid in your kit, you will probably not overcap immediately, and you will benefit from that much more. So for late game AA guards with a steroid, like for example Ram, this should be your best option most of the time, unless you have a specific goal. If you go no boots with this build and sell your boots at the end of the game, and get an Odysseus Bow instead, you can actually push this build past 900 DPS as well, so it doesn't stop there. It has more lifesteal than any other option, as you get more lifesteal through the crits, through the heavier hitting basics, which is very interesting, especially in the combination with Asi if you get to lower points of health. It also is better than the option with Ichaival and Devourer's Gauntlet. It just simply out DPSs that. And if you try to ditch Executioner for something else, you will heavily drop DPS, so don't do that. It is debatable if you can call crit the winner of the current DPS comparison based on that, because the DPS values aren't outrageously higher, And you also have to keep in mind that many of the other builds have other benefits that specific characters can utilize better. But what it means is that you have a lot of flexibility, and I think that's a very cool part here, because if you look at these builds, a lot of them start out almost the same way. You start out with Ninja Tabe, Transcendence, and Asi, and after that you will probably need Executioner most of the time anyways. If you want to, you can still consider Ichaival after that, or you want it for early aggression, then it doesn't benefit you as much here anymore. But if you go for these 4 items, you can't go all too wrong. They're in almost any build here. And you can choose to go into crit afterwards, especially if you feel like you're going to be ahead, if you're going to be 1v1 trading a lot. Or you can go into oboe if you have more team fights, or you can go into kins if the enemy team has more health. It's all very, very flexible as long as you stick to those 4 core items. Or you say you skip out on the Transcendence as well, which is possible too, and maybe go for a 3rd crit item and lower your DPS for Poison Star or whatever. But there's also the option to go no boots at some point of the game with the new pods that we have, and I want to look at that as well just to have a bit of a comparison too. For that I went with the initial build once again, with Transcendence, Ichaival, Asi, the Executioner and Concise, but I swapped out Ninja Tabai for Silverbranch Bow. The damage that we get here, the DPS, the raw DPS is 1190. The power on the first hit is 248, so the highest value after basically Bloodforge. The DPS on the first hit is 616, which is actually pretty close to the crit build right here. And on the 4th hit, our power is 293, so a lot for ability-based characters again, and I love Pen for that as well, by the way. And the DPS is 856. So at this point, the no boots build would actually have higher DPS than the crit build, but that's as long as the crit build still has Ninja Tabe and doesn't have oboe. If you include Odysseus Bow in this build instead, it only loses 13 DPS as well. We had 843 then. So it's not like you're forced to go into Silverbranch as the last item. It just gives you some benefit in some regard. And depending on the situation, Odysseus Bow can again benefit you more, especially in team fights. So we have some incredibly close outcomes between all these builds here that make it very easy to decide what you want to do with your build on the spot instead of going for that one predetermined route. And I think that's excellent. I think that's how the meta should be. But I kind of suspect that Asi will see some nerfs sooner or later because I think it's a bit overwhelming at this point with all that it offers. Especially the base lifesteal as well, that's not even included in these calculations here. If you're new to the channel, feel free to click the sub button and maybe the bell, it really helps me out. Also, let me know in the comments down below if you enjoyed this style of video, if you want me to go this in depth on items and explain all the different details, or if you'd rather have a shorter breakdown with some of the best options. I figured it would be fun, and especially with the circumstance at the moment, it's easier for me to make a very long video from time to time, but I don't know if this is something you guys enjoy or if you'd rather have the shorter option and then another breakdown in another video. With that, thank you guys very much for watching. I hope to see you all for the next one soon. I won't say tomorrow because I can't promise anything. DukeSloth, out.